is going to keep the bugs away if it doesn't keep the temperature too low. So yes, this is a Cracker Barrel, and I did like anyone does well now, is just Googled it, and the Cracker Barrel philosophy says that it is an honest and simple or direct opinion such as those expressed during a friendly conversation or argument. And the phrase was originally used for discussions around the large barrel of crackers, so kind of an older
we have.
There we have. Kind of like an early water cooler discussion. So we are here to share stories of local people who are no longer with us, and just that they should be respectful and rated PG preferably, and so people can share. We have a few people who want to start us off, but I'm really glad you came out, and I will pass it on.
Can I just interject?
Yes.
If Jim Granger's here, would he mind standing up?
Or waving?
Where is the standing ovation? But I listed him as somebody who is no longer with us. And son of Gunny is here.
The floor is yours.
Too complicated for it. I would just like to thank you all for coming, and I would like to thank the support to the Ice House that you've all done over the years and will continue to do. One of the reasons we're here tonight is because the family of the Kidders have been so great in trying to keep this thing going, and starting after Bill's passing many years ago, 15, 16 years ago. So, but and the other thing that happens here is that there's a huge group of volunteers that have helped over the years, and it seems to grow more and more, and they all work together. And it's really a very wonderful thing, and we always wondered how it was going to go, and it's gone a long time now. One of the responsibilities tonight is Carla Marshall and Doug Baxter have been doing a lot to get this set up, and you deserve a lot of thanks to do this. I just come up and say hi. So. So on the other end is that I just wanted to bring some history on what we're doing. We did this 4 or 5 years ago before the COVID. David Kidder and myself were at the library and his crew, and we had a pretty good turnout. And how many, show of hands, how many were at that the last time around?
Cool.
Okay, well that means I've lost a few stories because I already told them there.
We won't remember.
I know if I won't remember. So thank you all for coming, and hopefully with the breeze we won't get too many bugs tonight. Will Kidder was up here last night, and he said about 6 o'clock the bugs were so bad that they aren't tonight, so that's good with the breeze. But for getting this rolling, we have Michael Todd as moderator, and I'm going to let him take over, and if you get out of hand, he'll take care of it. We do have quite a few stories, and each person will spend a little bit of time doing it. Mike will, I guess, stop you if you're gone too long.
I don't know how this works. I have no gavel.
He might have.
I have nothing. I got nothing.
He might have a few stories himself. Anyway, you're the man. So.
Thank you.
Okay.
Don't go too far away, buddy.
All right, I won't.
Pete and I grew up in New London, and our families were quite close, actually, and a lot of stories originated between us. But I don't want to moderate this thing in any sort of a sense. I have a few stories, a few historically based stories I wanted to share, and I think this is a great opportunity. You'll have to excuse me because I wasn't at the first Cracker Barrel. I wish I had been there. I wish I had heard David moderate. I would have had some more sense of how things were going to go.
He was great.
I'm sure he was, and I'll do the best I can. I have a list of stories here. The problem is that many of these stories that were handed down to me by my father and Bill Kidder and others, is they generally center around alcohol and other things, and they're just not sometimes not appropriate in mixed company. I just have to be honest about that. So we have to do the best we can.
They said PG, not G.
So I think what I want to do is start with a historically based story to get us going. And this might trigger things in your mind, and if you have some kind of a story, then let's hear it. But I want to start with a story that was told to me by Jim Messer. And as a matter of fact, when I got out of high school, I attended a broadcasting school in Boston, Massachusetts, and so I was really into radio and television and all that. And so, I never went anywhere without my little cassette recorder. I came home to New London one weekend with my cassette recorder in my pocket, and sure enough, Joey Messer's house was going up for auction. And this was a big event. It was in the newspaper. So I went over there with my recorder in my pocket. It was a scene. I won't get into the details, but in the middle of it, up the road comes Jim Messer with a sulky and a side delivery rake. He's going up to Delafields to rake hay with his team of horses. So I said, Jim, you mind if I jump on? No, get right on. So I got on there. We got up to Delafields, and I turned the recorder on, and I said, Jim, why don't you tell me some stories about New London? And well, he's driving his team of horses, and you can hear the chains jingling, and you can hear him talking to the team. Give me a ha, give me a G, give me a ha. And he's telling me all these stories, and I got about an hour and a half of it on tape. And I took it down to, and I was smart, because I put metal tape in the recorder. So I got the best quality recording you could possibly get. And I took it down to Jerry Putnam, and he digitized it, put it on CD, and it's captured now, fully captured, and it's in the town archives. And there's some totally great stories on there. And one of the stories concerns Henry Stanley, and I went through the Mirror to America. This is J. Dwayne Squire's book, looking for a picture of Henry Stanley. Henry Stanley was a road agent when I was a kid, and he was in his 60s at that point, tall and lanky, and he had these huge hands. I can remember him driving the grader. And when I was a little kid walking to school, when he waved to you in the grader, his hands were so big, all he did was have to tip his hand on the steering wheel, and then that was it. You could see it, because his hands were so big. When he was in his 20s, Jim was probably 12 or 13. And Jim's father was a teamster. Jim's father made his living hauling goods with horses for people. Pulpwood, cordwood, whatever you had, you hired a teamster like you'd hire a trucker today, which is why the truckers are called the Teamsters Union, because it all came from teaming horses. That was how you moved goods in the historical America. And Henry was hired out by Elmer Messer, Jim's father, to drive a team. And their contract was to haul logs to Trow's Mill in Sunapee. Now, I don't know if you know where that is, but Trow's Mill is on the lower Sunapee Road, Lower Main Street in Sunapee. And so once the lake froze, and Jim used to rave about how the economy of the area centered around Lake Sunapee. When the lake froze, goods could be moved. Pulpwood could be moved, cordwood, logs. They even moved houses. They even skidded houses across the lake in the winter. As soon as it froze up, the boys went busy teaming. And Elmer had a contract to haul logs to Trow's Mill. And he hired Henry Stanley in his 20s to drive the team across the ice with logs. Henry never done that before. Kid in his 20s, he didn't know. So he was sitting around a wood stove in Jim Messer's kitchen over there at King Hill House. And Henry said to Elmer, he says, what do I do if the horses break through the ice? Well, Elmer says, Henry, you got your penknife in your pocket, don't you? Well, yeah. Every farmman had a penknife in his pocket. He says, you just reach down. As the horses go through the ice, you just reach down and cut the hamstrap. So that maybe because some of you might not understand what I mean by that, I brought this collar. This is a collar. This is some stuff that has been collected by the Ice House. This is actually a pony collar. It's not a full horse collar. But these outer parts where the rings are called the hames. And these items are solid, rigid material that transfers the load from the collar of the horse to the tug straps, which bear all of the stress on the load behind. And these two hames are held in place by a 1-inch strap at the bottom of the collar and a 1-inch strap at the top. I don't have straps on here, but I just have string because we didn't have this time. And actually, these hames don't actually fit the collar. The reins would go through these loops and down to the bridle. And the reins would be loose at the end. They would not be tied together. They'd be loose at the end. So, you're the teamster, you're rocking along, and the horses go through the ice. And here's the top hame strap. So the collar stays on the horse. The horses break through, and you reach down with your penknife and flick the top hame strap. The hames fall away, and the horse lunges out of the hole with the collar on and is thereby saved. So the next morning, Henry went out on the ice with a load of logs, and sure enough, they broke through. And so Henry just reached down, cut the hame strap, horses got out of the hole, and they took them back to that building at the corner of 103 and King Hill Road, which is now an apartment house. And when you drive by, if you're going toward Newberry, you see the big doors. That back then was a blacksmith shop. We're talking about 1920. That was a blacksmith shop. And they took the horses back in there after they'd been through the ice, put them in that heated blacksmith shop, gave them a bran mash, and took them out on the ice the next morning. And Jim said to me, they didn't want to go. So that's my Teamster story with Henry Stanley. And of course, as a kid, I never knew that about Henry Stanley, but that's a true story. And it's a fascinating story to me about how survival, how you got along in the winter up here. I can remember my mother telling me when she went to college at Colby Sawyer and graduated in '44, she said, you know, there was only about 600 hardy souls that lived in New London in the winter. Colby Jr. And you got to know who your neighbors were, and you knew who to call when things didn't go just the way they were supposed to. And my mother told this story about my brother when he was 3 years older than I am. He passed away this January, which is too bad. But my mother was giving me a bath. I was 1 year old. And this is in that house on Old Main Street where I live now. We only heated the downstairs back then. She was giving me a bath. I don't remember this. I hear this. And my brother was 4 years old.
That was back when he had hair.
That was back when I had hair. And my brother and my mother had this dog, this English setter dog, black and white dog, called Freckles. Frecky, they call it. And my mother was busy with me, and my brother went out in the kitchen. He got all his winter clothes on, his hat and his mittens, his gloves, and he said, Frecky and I are going out. My mother's like, oh, okay. She thought he was going to go out and build a snowman or just stick around the house. Well, you know, she dealing with me, and she grabs me, and she goes out and she looks, and there's a set of tracks going out of sight toward the next house down street, which is, well, it's been owned by a bunch of people.
Indian Rock Farm.
Indian Rock Farm is a good generic way to thank you. I appreciate that. And the tracks went out of sight by Indian Rock Farm. My mother panicked, you know, so she calls, this is in the winter, she calls the rope tow down at Bob Buzzell's. Remember, they had a phone down there at that rope tow. They had these two rope tows down there. My father was running the, you know, crank phone down to rope tow, and the Colby girls were down there. Your father was teaching them how to ski. He had a class down there. Called my father in a panic. Andy's gone with the dog. I don't know where he went, and I can't go look for him because I got Mike. I can't leave the house. So my father came home, and your dad got the college girls, got the Colby girls out and said, we got a missing persons case here, and so they all spread out. And my father took the track, and that dog and my brother went past George Graves' house, took a right turn, went all the way down over the bank to Clark Pond, went back out to Clark Pond to Bog Road. And that's where my father caught him. At 4 years old. Yeah. But, you know, it was, what I remember about that story is not so much the miracle of the survival, is the way the community came together to help.
You didn't call 911.
There was no 911. They had a fire phone. That was it.
Tie?
Yeah. It's great stuff. It's all great stuff. I don't want to run out of material, but anybody know what this is? Anybody ever seen one of these? Yeah.
That's a brake on a Log and scoot.
This
Yeah.
is a sled dog. The technical term is a sled dog.
Okay. Keep it-
And the width, this is hand forged, and it's the width of this is the same width as the wooden top on a scoot, the sled runner. And so this would through bolt on the wooden part. The bottom of the sled runner would be sheathed in iron, some kind of band iron. And this would be at the very end of the runner. And so you tipped it up like that, and then when you went up a hill, you flipped it down. And so if you were starting up the hill and you had to stop, this dog would keep the sled from going backwards against the horses, give the horses a little break. They wouldn't have to hold the weight of the sled while they were resting. And I don't know where the heck this came from. I have no idea. But Jim Messer told me a story one time about he was hauling wood, and he was teaming for Dura Crockett. Dura Crockett's pictures in this book. He had a dairy farm down at where the brew pub is. That great big house down at the corner.
Crockett's
Crockett Dairy. Crockett's Dairy. And that whole side hill, Rowell Hill, all those fields were Crockett Dairy, part of Crockett's Dairy.
Concord grapes
Yeah, there you go.
lining the
Is that I
path up there.
Really,
The
really.
roadway up to the pasture.
And you know, Mary Baxter Foley, God rest her soul, used to tell me about how she had that red house down on the main street. As you go past Cleveland's big field, if you look to the left, way up there's this big old colonial, Federalist actually. I think it's a hip roof Federalist. Beautiful cottage.
She had a good looking daughter too.
I know. That's not
He
a story
should
for today. Anyway, she used to tell me how she could get on her horse and ride down to Crockett's Corner, go right up over Rowell Hill. This is before '89. Go right up over Rowell Hill, straight down the other side, take the horse swimming in Keezer Lake, and ride all the way home. Never see another car the whole time.
Musterfield Farm.
Yeah, where Musterfield is, right around Musterfield.
Mom did that.
Huh?
Mom did
Your mother
that.
did that too? Yeah. And and that was, of course, she worked when she was here when the Littles precursors, Shepherd's Stable. She worked at Shepherd's Stable. Anyway, back to this. So anyway, he was teaming down Dura Crockett's, and he had this little thing on the back of his sled, and he's starting his team. They're drawing up the road with nothing on the sled, and there was this kid there helping, young kid. Jim didn't tell me what the kid's name was. He was probably 12, 13 years old. So Jim's riding along, and he says to the kid, says, "My dog down?" Meaning he's going uphill. He wanted the dog down. So if he stopped, it would stop the sled. Says to the kid, "My dog down?" Kid looks all around. He says, "I don't think you brought your dog with you, Mr. Messer." You'd only appreciate that. You know what this was. Great stuff, you know. I don't think you brought your dog with you, Mr. Messer. Well, it isn't all about me, but since nobody's chiming in, I'll tell you one other story.
They haven't had a chance.
This is it. What do you got? Yeah.
Before we leave Mary Foley, her inner kitchen, she had the stall for the horses was right next to the kitchen, and it had a Dutch door.
Yeah.
And the top would open, the horse would be looking right at you in the kitchen.
Yeah, Reverend Yardley used to go up and visit Mary Baxter Foley, and he couldn't get over how the horse's head was right in the kitchen. That's great stuff. Thank you for that. That's good.
Cats all over the counter.
Oh, cats in the counter, yeah. So first job I ever had as a kid was working for your grandfather, Putnam. Left kid garage. And of course, I got the job at 14. You weren't supposed to pump gas legally until you were 16, but nobody said anything. We just kind of went on about it. And your grandfather was great because he gave me a lot of lessons I learned that I really made a great use of later on. And one of those lessons was getting to know who your customers were. You know, he made it a point that you knew who everybody was when they came in. You greeted them by name, and you chatted them up, and you made them feel welcome and glad that they came to patronize your establishment. So I got to know them sooner or later. I got to know them all. And one day, this guy came in living in Springfield. And his name was George Lenz. and he was a baker. And actually, Peg, where's Peg?
Right here.
Peg, there. So Peg and George Lenz lived in Springfield.
Yes.
And Peg grew up in Springfield, and she remembers George. Do you want to tell us just how you remember him, what it was about him?
Well, Mom used to always take us, when we were trick-or-treating for Halloween, she would always take us to Mr. and Mrs. Lynn's because they had the best food, because they were bakers and just, they loved kids. They didn't have children of their own,
Right.
but they loved kids, so Mom always took us there for Halloween.
That's a great story. And I never knew that about him. All I knew was, Bill told me he was a baker and he was a customer, and Mr. Lynch treated him like he was in.
However, we didn't call him George. We did call him Mr. Lynn's, but I knew he had a nickname, which I won't bring up.
He has a nickname. And so he goes, he comes back in. I go back in, and I'm writing up the charge slip, and Bill's leaning up against the radiator.
Yeah.
And he says, you know who that was? I said, that's Mr. Lenz. And he said, that's Zipper Lenz. And I said, Zipper? Yeah, that's Zipper Lenz. Okay. He says, yeah. I said, well, tell me about, I'll tell you the story. He says, he was on his way home from Concord one night, driving up old Route 4, but on there by the, I guess it's the Blackwater River down the end over, kind of winding road like this. And he's driving up the road, and he heard the call of nature. So he pulled over into the siding there, and he got out and was answering the call, and a car come down the other way, and the headlights. No zipper. Well, he worked on it. He got back in the car. And the wife had the flashlight out. She worked on it. The two of them went. Oh, Jesus. Had to go up to the hospital. Had to go up to the hospital and see old Clough. Old Doc, and I guess it was old Doc Clough. It wasn't young Doc Clough. They had to see old Doc Clough.
Bill Clark.
Had to get his little scalpel out. So, in a small town, things get around. And that's how Zipper got his name. No, I never called him that. God rest his soul. He was a great baker and a great guy, and that's the story of Zipper Lenz. And I'm hoping that's about as wild as we're going to get, but you never know. Anybody have any? Does that remind? Yeah, go ahead, Lori.
I have a question for Peg, having grown up in Springfield.
Yes,
When I was growing up on Knights Hill, this lady from Springfield, Miss Colby?
Maybelle Colby.
Maybelle Colby used to come
She lived
into
on
New
Philbrook Hill.
okay.
She did.
And she had a little farm.
Yes.
And in the summer, she would drive through New London up and down the streets in her truck.
Yes.
With, I think it had a canvas that the sides rolled
She
up.
had slats on the sides and a little canvas.
Yeah, okay, I'm remembering right.
Yes, you are.
And she would have in the back of her truck big buckets full of gladiolas and baskets of vegetables and stuff. And she'd go door to door, and this was in the 50s.
Yep.
Well, I remember that.
And I want to see Maybelle Colby in the parade driving the truck. I wanted to get her history. Maybelle Colby.
Maybelle Colby.
Was she married?
No, she was maiden
Okay.
lady.
Okay, thank you.
Very cool. Thank you, Peg. This is great. I'm so glad you came. I don't know what it is.
One thing that I think
I don't care.
in the Jim Messer hauling for the trout.
Yeah.
Well, the trouts are your mother's family, are they
That's
not?
correct.
There you go.
And my grandmother, okay, so that would have been, oh my Lord. So we go back to Fred and Gusty. Their mother was a trow.
Yeah,
Yes. Edward Todd married a trow.
that's your tie to.
And my
to
grandmother,
something,
Nana Todd, used to say that it was the trows that gave us all the hook noses and the alcoholism. That's what Oh yeah. Oh god. Yeah. Nana Selena was. Oh yeah. Yeah, that's true. That's true. So we are related to the Trows from Sunapee, Tink Trow, Colonel Trow from Sunapee, and the mill and all that. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Mary Dallas.
Yeah. I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to attend a town meeting moderated by Tink Trow, Colonel Trow over in Sunapee, because he knew everybody. He knew all the dirt on everybody. And Colonel Trow, he ran a meeting. Yeah, but I never had a chance to do that. I did meet him. I met him at the mill one time, but I never had a chance to attend the meeting. Yeah, no, I'm happy to have anybody else chime in that's got a story.
I'll just chime in real
Yep.
fast. I'll be quick. Talking, Michael, remembering working up at the gas station. This was my first job here, working for my grandfather in summers, probably when I was 11 or 12, and it was a really interesting job, fun job, and we were always amazed. We would try to do things and polish things and clean things, and then he would do it twice as fast and probably 3 or 4 times as well as we did. And when this used to be bluestone, we would sit here, my friend and I, we would weed this, and when he would go to Concord, we would know he would be gone to Concord, and he'd be gone for a while, so we would kind of just sit here and more kind of sunbathe than actually weed. And I have one memory when Michael was here riding the big bikes for the 4th graders. They came on Monday, and I remember Sam Woodger worked for my grandfather. He was kind of the older, more senior person, and he was riding the big bike one time, and my grandfather was running beside him right on that driveway, and he was running. It was probably the only time I really saw my grandfather run, and his trousers came down. Laughing so hard, and he was holding Sam, and when he let go to pull his trousers back up, Sam kind of wobbled a little bit, and I said, oh my gosh, but I think he bailed out on the grass right there. But that was just a wonderful memory, and I hear his voice in the video in there, and it just was really great memories about that and this place, and so just little things I remember. So I should have with that.
Great, thank you, Pablo. That's wonderful. John, you got something to tell us? Here.
Sure. Well, what got me thinking was you started right off with Henry Stanley. And, of course, when we were kids, and his road grader, and he'd always come down, and you know, because whenever there was a big snow, it was always the grader. I don't know, probably had a V-blade on it. I can't remember what the blade on it. I just remember it was
The D8. It was the D8 with the V-blade on it. The grader was when there wasn't too much snow. It was the D8 when nothing else would go.
The DA had the wings beside it.
It has a V-plow and the wings on either side, and it would move 4 feet of snow with no problem.
But when there was good snow, he always made sure the dock could get uptown. So he always right in the driveway with that grader and right up to the shed. And at the time, I thought that they plowed everybody's driveway.
Everybody that voted for him.
But we, as a pack of kids, I mean, I don't know, it would have been sometime in the early 60s. So probably me, Jimmy Granger, I don't know, a few others, always out on the road walking around, and whenever Mr. Stanley, no, Mr. Henry, we always called him Mr. Henry. Mr. Henry, he'd come by with a grader, he'd stop and bail us all in the cab of that. Uptown we'd go, and that was fun. But then later I had the pleasure of working with him. I must have been 15 or so, and he took care of the grounds over at Fox Stand in Springfield. And he needed a grunt to pull weeds and vacuum the pool and do things he didn't want to do over there. Anyway, that was one of my first real jobs as a teenager. And I learned a lot from Mr. Henry. But the thing I remember most was at 9 or 9:30, we'd have to stop and go eat lunch. And I remember the first time that came up. Lunch? What do we got to do at noontime? That's dinner. So for most of my life, I've known that there's actually 4 meals a day: breakfast, lunch, dinner, and supper. And to this day, it annoys me when people call supper dinner.
Well,
But I remember I was 15 because I pedaled my bike up and Mr. Henry would pick me up at Kidder Garage, and I'd probably leave my bike there, and so I'd ride over with him in the morning. And some days, probably either if he couldn't go and he wanted me to go, or more likely that I was too late, overslept, and my mom had to take me, and most of the time I would drive, but that's why I know I was probably 15, because I get to drive, and because back then I remember, I think I had my license like the day after maybe on my 16th birthday. You know, we were ready to go get them, but often as not, it'd be the Model A. Because our old Model A was the spare car, and I had older sisters and with driver's licenses, and so it wasn't uncommon for the Model A to be the only car left for my mom to use. And I remember that. I think about how people today don't know how to drive a car, that you got a double clutch, or even if you clutch at all.
Try Model T.
Speaking of that licensure exam, Pete Stanley, isn't there a story? You want to tell us that story about you?
Yeah. Henry Stanley was my cousin, and I worked for Henry Stanley when he was still working when he was still road agent. And one time, I was working for the water department, and Henry, on behalf of the water department, came to grade the road up to Morgan Pond. And I think I was 15. And does anybody here know what a stone fork is? Yeah. Not very many. But so what I had to do was walk behind the grader with a stone fork, picking the stones out of the road, tossing them off into the bushes.
Also called a goon spoon.
Yep. And I went up to Morgan Pond and back twice that day behind Henry Stanley. And you're absolutely right. We had to stop for lunch and then dinner. But it was the longest work day of my entire life. But the story about the license is kind of interesting. Now, at the time I lived down in Wilmot, and with my mother and father divorced, so I wasn't up on Stanley Farm then. I wanted to go to get my license on my 16th birthday. It was a Wednesday, 1962. And I had made arrangements. I actually.
I was going to say, but who's counting?
So I had to get, my mother had broken her leg skiing, so she couldn't drive me. You know, I was stuck. I had to get somebody to take me down. And I was friends with Ralph Marshall, who would later become the police chief here. And Ralph at the time was working at Marshall's Garage, where David is now. And so I arranged with Ralph to get a ride down. And drove me down to Concord. I had memorized everything. I was already to take my test. I'd made out my little application and whatnot, and went up to the office, which was right across from the State House in those days, motor vehicle office was. And I walked in and went up to the lady at the counter, and she took my application, and way down at the end of the hall, there was an open office door, and the director of motor vehicles was in there, and he looked out and saw me. Well, it happened that he lived in Wilmot. And he came out, walked up to the, wait a minute, she said, and he came up and took the application away and said, just give him a driver's license, he's been driving for years. True story.
know, and I remember 2 stories about Henry Stanley, briefly. One was told to me by Charlie Whittemore, God rest his soul, who worked for the town when Henry was a road agent. And they were cutting the roadsides up there on Berkeley Hill. And Henry Stanley's wife was a bit of a recluse. Nobody ever saw her. So they were mowing the roadsides, and of course, if she came out of the house, they'd hide behind the trees, hide behind the maple trees up there, just to, you know. And as soon as she saw him, she'd run back in the house. And sometimes they'd have dinner they had lunch, supper, lunch. I get all confused. They would have a quote meal, and Mrs. Stanley would bring out homemade ice cream. And I remember Charlie Whittemore saying, boy, that was the best vanilla ice cream he'd ever had in his life. And the other story was courtesy of Bob and Michael, who was able to get on tape before he died. A great guy. And he told me he worked for the town road crew when Henry was the road agent. And I don't want this to be too off color, but given the fact that we know Henry ate 4 meals a day, we can probably connect the dots. So he was, Bob was the new guy at the shop, you know, and you work in a shop of guys, and there's always some knucklehead trying to play some jokes on somebody. Well, somebody took a liking to Bob and said, listen, you know, and they had a garage down there, and they only had one portalet, shall we say. And they said, listen, when Henry Stanley comes through that door, you don't want to be in there. And Bob's like, okay. So sure enough, they're all sitting around there waiting for the boss man to get there, and Henry comes through that door, comes into the garage, through that door, and just peels his jacket off, peels off his suspenders, and goes, ooh, right to that room. So God help you, don't be in that room when Henry walks in the door. I was kind of like that one.
Always wore overalls.
Oh yeah, big overalls, you know, just peeling stuff right off, headed right for the door. Yeah, you don't negotiate that. Good old Henry. Yeah, who?
Question. I've been volunteering here at the Ice House for several years, and I occasionally keep hearing stories about Jules Bellerin. I wondered if anyone here could tell us more about Jules Bellerin, and one in particular that I don't know if it's true or not, but our old fire engine here, the London number 2.
Yeah.
When he was
my grandfather.
okay.
Yeah. So Jules Bellerin, right? He was in the Navy during the war. He was a Navy man, and he sold sunfishes. He was a nautical guy. If you had anything nautical, when I was a kid, you went to see Jules Bellerin. And actually, Bob McMichael, as a young man, grew up. The Bellerins took him in. That's where he lived. He was an orphan. And he came out of Manchester, and he lived here. And that's why he served New London in all his capacities he could.
Yes.
In his later life, because he, as an orphan, came here and just felt so blessed that he landed here on the shores of Little Lake Sunapee with the Bellerin family in New London. And he just felt so good about that. And at his age, he wanted to give back to town everything he could. And I was always really moved by that story.
This is Jules' grandson.
The fire truck story is a great one, and I wasn't there. I only heard it the other day, but it was a Cosmo in there, wasn't it? Was it Cosmopolitan?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Do you know the story?
I do. I heard the story a number of times from both Jules and from Bob, or from Bill Kidder.
Yeah.
So you're
Please,
his.
You are.
I'm Dan Lewis.
Okay, Dan. Yeah, go ahead and tell us.
Grandson. Yeah.
Jules is my grandfather. I grew up with him in that house, and there was some many colorful stories from him, especially after 10:30 when it was time for his first meal. Liquid meal, sorry. But yeah, that old Cosmo in there. Jules was a member of the volunteer fire department back then, and the story, as I know it, was they were heading to a call somewhere down towards Crockett's. And Jules was driving that truck, and who was with him, Pete? I don't remember.
I'm not sure. Burke Hunter might have been with him.
I can't remember, but they were headed down that hill towards Crockett's, and Jules went to step on the brakes of that thing to slow down, and the wheel came off in his hands.
Oh, well, they're mechanical brakes.
They're mechanical
so you're
brakes.
standing on the lever, and the only way you have to add leverage is to pull up on the wheel while you're stepping on the brake.
Jules weighed about 120 pounds. it was a lot of effort for Jules to get those things to stop because he didn't have the weight behind him. So he was literally standing and pulling on that wheel while he was trying to stop that truck and rip that wheel right off the steering column. and again, I can't remember who was with him, but he reached over and grabbed the handbrake, and the two of them were doing God knows what, trying to stop that truck, and eventually slowed it down enough, and I guess they got it stopped to where he could get the wheel back on the shaft.
What's that?
I heard that story a number of times from Bill, because I spent a couple of summers here working for Bill at the Ice House, and
That's that truck.
and that truck, and so you know it. He told me it was cursed, and that was the one thing I wasn't allowed to drive to.
The other thing about that story is that at that time, now you come down to what we call Crockett's Corner, the four corners.
It looked a little
Stop.
different, yeah.
But there was a long sweeping turn toward Elkins. And so if you were going too fast, I mean, I remember as a kid, you know, big logging trucks, you know, flipping over there because they came down the hill and the brakes went. Of course, that was before 89 was there. So.
And it's funny because later on in life, when I was on the volunteer department with you guys, we were responding to that mill up on King Hill Road that burned.
Oh, yeah.
And I was driving the Pierce to that call.
Which time?
And me and I think it was Amy were in the truck running. I remember she was throwing clothes on because she showed up at the fire department in just a bathing suit. And I was driving the Pierce down the hill, and I missed a gear coming down the hill. And it was, again, Dan standing on the damn brake while he's pulling on that thing, and that's all I could think of was Jules. And I managed to catch the ramp going down towards 89 slow enough and finally got it into gear, but both of us missing that hill wasn't a good omen.
Does anybody else have any stories about?
I've got one about Oscar Colby.
Ladies first.
But wait a minute, I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt. But I just want to make sure everybody understands how New London came to keep that Cosmo. That is a great story. So they sent this guy up, so they traded that engine when they bought a new one, and a representative of the company came up on the train to Potter Place, took a stage to New London, and his job was to drive that Cosmopolitan back to the company.
Because they bought that new truck.
Because they bought that new fire truck. And so he came up to the gas station, the Kidders, to gas it up, to drive it back. And Bill, your grandfather, Will's grandfather, went out there and made the guy an offer and said, "Listen, tell you what, I'll buy your train ticket back to the city for whatever money. You leave the truck right here." And the guy's like, "Oh, he had to wrestle that truck all the way back to wherever it was going, all square gears, standard transmission, oh my God, and that Armstrong power steering." And the guy said, "By God, I'll take it." And he took the money and left the truck right there. They took him down, got him on the train, sent him back where he left him. That's how we kept that fire engine. Because your grandfather had that foresight to recognize a deal in the middle. So there, I'll leave that. Now you can tell us.
So one of your prompts in the ad was Oscar Colby. Does anyone remember Oscar? Yeah. Okay, so I've written this up as a grave situation. Oscar Colby from Springfield was a giant of a man. He worked for John Holteen in New London florist and landscaping business, but also did odd jobs, strong as an ox, willing, resourceful, affable. Oscar was one of the handful of citizens who enjoyed a cold Valentine ale after a hard day's work. Even sometimes just starting a hard day. Oscar's work clothes consisted of trousers, a gray sweatshirt streaked with proper amounts of grip, and a baseball cap, the bill of which always stood straight up, towards heaven. Oscar was often called upon by the town to dig graves, or at least complete the finishing touches after a backhoe had done its best. His stature was great help to his being able to size up the task at hand. While standing in a grave, if Oscar could peer over the rim, He knew he had to remove a little more soil. You see, Oscar stood over 6 feet tall. Likewise, horizontally, Oscar was 6 feet long. In that position, if his toes and cap touched the sides, he knew he had to get a bit more soil off the edges.
Yep.
Occasionally, while perfecting a grave on a hot summer afternoon, Oscar would toss down a couple of refreshing ales, then take a moment to recline on the floor of the damp, cool grave. Frequently, if the perfection of his efforts resulted in a comfortable resting place for the dearly departed, Oscar would take a nap, surprising the bejesus out of it anyone who came to inspect the grave.
Add a little addendum to that. I remember as a kid growing up, and Oscar was always, I live on Main Street where the cemetery is, so I would see him from time to time. And I remember Walt Chadwick telling me this great story about having there was a funeral down at in the end of the cemetery toward the Bog Road. And there's a storage shed down in the Old Main Street Cemetery, and there's a two-holer in the back of the building. And Oscar had dug the grave, and he was just kind of hanging out waiting the service to be over so he could backfill it. And nature called, and he went to answer the call. He went to that two-holer in the back, just got seated, and
Henry Stanley was on his way through.
no. Worse than that. Little white-ass hornets had built a nest about and so your Walt's got this tent up, and then they're trying to conduct this funeral. And over there is this hooting and hollering, and Oscar comes out around the end of the door, out of the door of the shed with his pants down. Oh my Lord, poor man! That just felt so bad. And before this became the Ice House. Bill Kidder, this was Bill's land. He had this down there, and the big building was a warehouse, and he stored tires and stuff in there. And out behind the warehouse, they had some old cars that were just kind of in transition. They were on the way to the junkyard, but they hadn't gotten around to taking them down there yet. And they had this old '49 Ford coupe down there, four-door. And Oscar was sleeping in it. He was just, sleeping in the driver's seat.
That's where he was living.
He was living in it. And so, come time to take the car to the dump, and they sent David down there with a wrecker to hook onto it and take it. David went hooked on the front of it, and he looked in the passenger side. The driver's side was empty, but the back was level full of empties. He just throw them in the back seat. Level full. And talk about fermented, the windows up in the hot sun. Oh my God. Just tow it to the junkyard. We are done with that.
Well, I heard a little more in that story, and that was that Oscar was still in the car, sleeping in the back. Oh, that was a wagon. So David backed up to hook onto the car, and he had to open the door to sit in it to get it out of gear and everything. All of a sudden, here comes Oscar. He's like, "Wow!" He'd seen the ghost. Of course, it smelled like that too. I don't know whether that was the same car, but it was similar to that. So, but we've got more people that want it.
This is great. Yeah. Who is just
George?
George. Yeah. Shoot, George. I'd love to hear from you.
Well, I had a little bit to Oscar Colby, please.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Sure. Have it.
Ladies first.
I was a late comer here, so I didn't come here in the 50s or whatever. And I worked at the St. Andrews kindergarten up here in town, and I had a 4-year-old boy, and I worked with Ed Linehan and Lynn Powell. And we had a lovely little kindergarten there. And every Wednesday, we would take the kindergartners through the back door of the church and over by the hotel and across the street to go to the library to get a book. And Oscar Colby was at Kidder, at his office, as they called it, Kidder Garage. He'd stand in the corner, as he did every Wednesday he was there. And all the kids would go by, "Hi Oscar, hi Oscar, hi hey kids, how you doing kids?" All the time. So one day, the Linehans had a little girl who was only 3 at the time, and she was younger than most of the children in the school. And so she was always sort of put down by the other kids. They didn't want to do anything with that little kid. And so she was always trying to get a little attention. So one day we're coming back from the library, and the kids are all walking across the main street and then up the sidewalk, and Oscar's standing on the corner, and all the kids are, bye Oscar, bye Oscar, bye kids. So we get back to the school, and little Tara Linehan is sitting there. They're taking off their coats and their hats and their gloves and their boots and all the things. And Tara Linehan says, well, in case you don't know it, Oscar Colby is really my father. Because all the kids knew who Oscar was. I told Paul that story, and he knows all about it.
I take it they didn't tell that story when he got his Third of a Century award? That was last Sunday, wasn't it?
Yeah.
George, what are you been waiting?
Well, this is my wife Gail, and we moved here in 1966 from Virginia, and I taught school at the middle school up here for X number of years. Anyway, my story is the first year we moved up here, I was not coaching anything. I was teaching over at Stevens High School. So I tried to learn how to ski. And Bud Lawrence was my ski instructor.
Wow.
And so Bud got me up on the slopes there and says, do you know how to do a snowplow? No, I don't know. So he showed me how to do a snowplow. We're on the Mock Turtle.
Yeah.
So we're going a little bit down the Mock Turtle. And you know, I'm a pretty big guy there, maybe 198 at that time. And I coached basketball, baseball, and so forth. And my legs just were not built for skiing. Not at that time, the muscles. So I'm going down a snowplow on the Mock Turtle, and all of a sudden my skis come together and I am flying down the slope. And I can hear Bud behind me just laughing like crazy. So I get down, and I'd seen these guys, you know, do a slide into second base and stop, and I'm thinking, how am I going to stop? I started to panic, and then I realized, hey, if I do slide into second base, I'll be great. For sure enough, I slid into second base, and the snow came up, and he came down, and he's just, the tears were coming out of his eyes, I tell you. And my next story has to do with a good friend of mine who, at the time, we were volunteer firemen. And this guy must have weighed no more than maybe 150, 160, and I weighed probably close to 210. So I was a volunteer fireman. And Jimmy Granger over here. Jimmy Granger over here. Now Jimmy liked to eat, and Jimmy couldn't have weighed at that. He couldn't have weighed more than 150. He was maybe at that much. He was lucky. All right. So it was in February, and we're at the old firehouse, and we used to have fireman's supper. And I forgot who was the chef that used to be at Colby.
Bob Bear.
But who was the other guy that went down? He had a restaurant on Route 4.
Reinhold. Stan Reinhold.
He used to work up at the Colby.
Stan Reinhold.
So Jimmy Granger was noted for his eating ability, and so was I. And so it was a cold February day, and I'd been out behind the house cutting wood, and I was just as hungry as a bear. And so we go to the firehouse for this dinner. And all of a sudden, I don't know, I guess we had a few drinks or so.
No.
And Jimmy and I had an eating contest. And it was hot dogs and beans, baked beans. And to end the story, this little rascal ate 10 hot dogs, but I ate 11 and I beat him.
But how many beans?
Apparently a lot that night, I found out. Jimmy, it's good to see you.
Again.
And that was when
Pleasant Street.
when the firehouse was here and everything was upstairs.
Yeah.
Right up on the corner here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pool table and
The old firehouse.
great place. It was.
Until it burned.
Until it burned. Luckily, we were outside.
Burn it down the firehouse.
Anybody else have a story they want to chime
Annie
in?
You have
Wolf,
a
you
story
came to
about
say-
the porcupine and Mary, porcupine for Mary
Yeah.
Haddad.
Mary had the porcupine. Okay, go for it.
Well, when I was a lad, about 15, I had actually didn't move to New London full time until I was 14, freshman in high school. And that was interesting because I came here from a middle school that's the population of the middle school was 1,500 kids in Connecticut. And I came here to New London High School and arrived on the opening day, and God, there were these young guys with their hot rod Fords. I mean, it was just like something out of American Graffiti. You know? And it went in there, and it was like the Wild West. I mean, it was a completely liberating experience for a young guy. But at any rate, when I was 15, there were bounties on all sorts of animals in those days, and there was a bounty of 50 cents on porcupines, and you had to bring the nose in to collect your bounty. And I had a 22, and people all around. I lived down on Pleasant Lake that first year, and people from all over the place would call me to come, take care of dispatch their porcupines, and there were a ton of them in those days. And it was, I needed it for gas money. My mother let me drive from there around the backside of the lake without any problem. And I would gather the noses and come in, and I don't know how many people here knew Mary Haddad, but Mary Haddad was a pretty straight-laced lady, good sense of humor, but she was pretty even keeled, She wasn't all that talkative and whatnot, but when she'd see me coming, I'd have a little paper bag full of noses. And I'd walk through the door with my paper bag, and Mary would say, "Oh, Peter," she said, "just tell me how many and take them away. I don't want to see them." And that's how I made my gas money.
Peg.
In relation to that, when Dr. Bears came here in 1998, somehow or other he got talking about how poor he was down in Chelmsford, Mass. And we kept saying to him, "You don't understand poor." We had, there were 3 brothers that had to share one room. He had 1 drawer, 1/3 of a closet, and we said, you had a closet. What's your problem? We told him about the porcupine noses and how everybody did that. He never got over that, and to this day, if he's around first of all, I told him if I had kept collecting those, it would have been ahead of my 403B probably. But anyway, to this day, if he's around someone that he wants to tell about the porcupine noses, he always turns to me and says, "Is it okay if I tell him your poor story?" And I said, "It's not a shame. Everybody did it. Everybody did it." Oh my God. I wish I still did. I know.
I remember my father telling me this story about a friend of his that was driving down the road one night, and a bobcat and their little kits were crossing the road, and their bounty was
$5.
Yeah, $5. And he stopped the car and opened up the trunk, and he went through. They couldn't find a tire iron. All he could find was a length of garden hose about that long. And he went out. I mean, it's pathetic to think about it. Flogged the heck. He couldn't stop any of them. They all got away. Oh God! This is part of growing up in this one. Do I see a hand back there? Shoot.
I'm not an old timer. I've only been here about 23 years. However, when we got married in Christmas time, 1968, we spent our wedding night at the Lamplighter Motor Inn. Didn't know we'd be back 40 years later.
It happened to be a blizzard. That's as far as we could get from Holderness.
Yeah, got married in Holderness on my way back to college in Utah.
Oh, wow.
Stopped here in a blizzard, Lamplighter Motor Inn, didn't know we'd be back in the 1990s. But again, not too old, but where the country press is here, I remember Harold Jennison's machine shop, manufacturing services of New Hampshire. I used to call him. I used to sell cast. I used to call him. And I remember he had a Lionel train set go around the top of his office up there. And you can sit at his desk and watch those trains go round and round.
I want to chime in with a story from a gentleman from Wilmot Flat. and I don't know if any of you remember him. His name was Carl Evans.
Oh,
Anybody
yeah.
remember Carl Evans?
I worked with Carl Evans, skinning.
Skin, there you go. This guy was a licensed New Hampshire guide. He got a farm deferment during the Second World War and spent that time cutting pulpwood with a crosscut saw in the woods around Wilmot Flat. And he was a big guy, and I can remember his big bull neck and his muscles and he was a boxer too. He was a pretty stout guy, I remember. And he sharpened saws. I sharpened all my father's hand saws, circular saws. He used to go to the Wilmot Town dump, you'd find people throw out all these circular saws and little saw blades. He'd bring them home, file them up, and sell them to the contractors in the area. This is before they got all the carbide tips on them. Brilliant. And he knew a lot of stuff. And he used to collect wild ginseng in all over the state of New Hampshire, and he knew where these things were, and he sold it. And when he lived in Wilmot, I used to go down there and talk to him all the time, and I can remember going down to visit him one night, and he said to me, he says, "You drink?" I said, "No, not really." He says, "Well, I didn't think so." He says, "Never smell nothing on you." So I said, "Okay." So anyway, my father came home and told me the story that Carl had told him, and I thought it was a great one. So I went back to Carl, and I heard him tell it direct to me, so I can go through my father. And years ago in Wilmot Flat, there was a lot of guys down there that really liked to go to see the Red Sox games. So once a year, they'd charter a bus, and it would pick them up, and they'd drive to Fenway Park for the Red Sox game, and then they'd bring them home. Well, sure enough, it's a bunch of guys being boys again, and they get on the bus, and sure enough, some guy brings in a case of beer, and so they start drinking beer, and they're riding down to Boston. And Carl's probably 70, middle 70s at that point. Had a big Santa Claus beard, and a big paunch, and he had some medical issues, and so it was hard for him to do what needed to be done on the, teetering around on the bus. He had to have both feet on the ground. So when they got down to the ball game, they parked in the, off a Yawkey Way. There's all these parking lots all over the place, and all the rest of the guys on the bus got off, and they went on to the ball game. Well, there was this fella named Reno that was with Carl. He was kind of with him there, and he didn't want to leave him alone. So Carl got off the bus, and with Reno there, and took care of business behind the bus, and then the two of them started down the ball game, down this alleyway. And the two of them were walking along, and I think there might have been another fellow with them, but I don't remember his name. So they're walking down the road, and sure enough, these three young kids come walking up the street. And this one kid comes walking up to Carl, and kind of walked right up to him. Said, "Where are you going, old man?" Carl looked at him and said, "Well," he says, "I rode down here on the bus, and I'm going to the ball game." And the kid, with his hands down by his side, says, dancing around, says, "Let me see you go, old man." Carl says, I stood up, he says, I faked him with a right, and I laid him right out in the gutter with a left. Just cold cocked him, laid him right out. He says, I turned around, and this other kid had Reno up against the wall trying to go through his pockets. So I come up to the kid, and I grabbed him right here, spun him around and said, "Why don't you pick on somebody your own size?" And he pointed to his friend. "Come on, Reno, we're going to the ball game." And he got home, and my father, and he said to my dad, "Well," he said, "kid called me an old man, but he found out I wasn't dead yet." I mean, you do that nowadays, if somebody would have pulled a knife, it would have been a whole different story. But back in the mid-60s, the early 70s, God bless him, Carl got away with it, I just love that story. I found out I was an old man, but I wasn't dead yet.
Bill Clock. I was just thinking that at this time of year, summer coming, for a lot of summer camps to be getting ready for their guests for the summer. And we lost a lot of diversity in the town when that whole movement collapsed, which it seems to have done, at least in this area. And I was just thinking we might put together a composite of how many there were. I'm thinking of Wallula, I'm thinking of Camp Sunapee,
Kearsarge,
Tonawanda,
Tonawanda,
Tabor,
yeah.
Great dating pool.
After bedtime. Colby Town Camp on backside of Little Sunapee.
A 6. Birch Brook, or what was?
Yeah, Birch Brook was on Keys or something.
And the Colby Town, so the college had this summer camp, Colby Town Camp on the backside of Little Sunapee, and they had this lodge, and Horace Stanley built that lodge.
No, he didn't build it. He moved it. It was up where the, that was actually the original town meeting house. It was up where the town hall is now. And he moved it down there.
Right.
And erected it for use by the college.
Horace Stanley, oh tut tut, oh tut tut, remember, he always was doing that. Oh,
that was my grandfather.
So then, when the college sold it, they took that building and they moved it up, and that's Lethbridge Hall. They've recycled all those beams that were recycled before they. Yeah, that was kind of a neat story. A lot of history there. Yeah.
I'm thinking of Rhoda Booth.
Oh, yeah. Camp Kearsarge.
Camp Kearsarge,
She was a presence.
Gilly was a buddy of yours, wasn't he, Peter?
Huh?
Wasn't Gilly Booth a buddy of yours?
Oh, he wasn't a buddy, but similar vintage.
I knew you wouldn't admit it.
Don't know. I don't know him.
He presided over a really good dating pool.
Except he wasn't quite as wild as you were. No, we forgot one. Caddy camp.
Caddy camp?
That was real diversity for us. There was something on Chronicle a few years ago about the kids that would come to caddy camp from Boston, or underprivileged kids that would come up and work for the summer. Quite a story. Yeah, that's what really. I'm glad
Colby Town Camp was too.
Yes. Yes. But the what'd you just say? The one down at the country club, I think that they took boys that were in the Boston area, and then they would caddy for the summer and learn, and then go home with a little bit of money at the end. I think John Kiernan may have been.
Yes, he was. Master.
Was he on? Yeah. So you
Jim
guys.
Bewley was too.
Who was?
Jim Bewley was. Yeah,
Was he?
Yeah. That's how we met V somehow. We met.
Yes.
Yeah. Dottie, sorry. V was the mother.
I have a couple more. Danny, you go. Please.
Well, way back in my time, not quite my time, we're not keeping up with Peter, but New London used to be a dry town.
That's right. That's right. Yep. Whole bunch of stories there.
There are a lot of stories that can be told about New London and dry town. And there was somebody that used to go on Friday afternoons to Doc Green's in Newport, because that was the only place the closest place you could buy hard liquor.
Right.
They sold beer, but not in New London. You had to go down to Elkins.
Yeah, or
you had to
Wilmette.
go to George's Mills.
Well, actually, it was Wilmette.
You went to Sillyville, that's right.
Right, Sillyville. B-Weed store down Sillyville. Yeah.
The town of Roger Landing.
Just across the line.
You had to just go across the line because New London was pure.
Sure.
They didn't sell any alcohol.
He made up for it.
Oh, yeah, well, we did do some drinking. But there was, there's two stories that go with that. There was Victor Dean, who was the postmaster.
Victor J. Dean.
Victor J. Dean, and I had the privilege of buying the old post office that Victor ran for years and years.
And his wife Charlotte.
And Charlotte Dean, who was claustrophobic.
Oh, shit.
And Charlotte Pitts Dean had a convertible.
Mustang?
She had a Mustang convertible.
Bright yellow.
And she had that top down all year round. I mean, it could be 13 below zero. And she was
They were both big people.
Yeah.
And to get in and out of that convertible with the top down would have been a challenge.
So, going along with New London's being dry and pure, we all had to go someplace else to buy our booze. And there was people that used to come in because Donnie Crystal used to deliver the alcohol to New London.
And on Friday afternoons, he would go into Kidder Garage and take the order. And drive to Newport and then bring it back and distribute it all. And so between that and Victor Dean, now in the window, in the garage, there was a big, one of those old cars, I can't remember, with a big bearskin rug on it. And Victor Dean, who was supposed the Stevens, I don't remember what it was. But the post office used to be where, well, I call it CB Coburn's is now. I don't know what yours is. Browns. So Victor would be there, and then he would walk home at lunchtime. But he would always make a little stop at Kidder Garage and go in and take the bearskin rug, make a shot or two, and then go home and take a shower. You know, and in a dry town, it was very important to have that bottle scattered around. And when Oscar Colby's car got moved out, there were so many beer cans in there that they had to just tip it right on its side and get rid of it.
Well, I've got a couple that I told this one before, so I was just trying to figure out how many people were here for the last one.
Oh, tell it again. Yeah,
Real forgot.
It's more of a modern history one, but both of the, well, all three victims are gone now. But Heidi and I had a cat named Oreo, where we live now on Davis Hill, Old Cape. And Oreo was quite a cat, fairly smart. Used to be able to open up doors. We had the old thumb latch type doors. So anyway, I don't want to kill the punchline, but so my dad, Bud Lauritsen, was awfully good friends with Bill Kidder, and Dad would go up and visit Bill. This was after Bill retired at what we called the God's Waiting Room, which was Bill's office. And so Dad would make the circle and go to the Historical Society, do whatever, and he'd visit Bill and try to find out what's going on for the day. And this was your grandfather I'm talking about, or great-grandfather.
Great-grandfather,
yeah. So anyway, Dad went up there one day and he said, Bill, he said, we got to go over to Pete and Heidi's. And Bill says, oh really, why? It's the middle of the day, work day, whatever. And so Bud says, I got to show you something. And Bill said, well, what is it? And he says, well, I'll tell you on the way. He said, Pete and Heidi have this cat, and it actually can open doors by itself. It's pretty smart. So they drove in, nobody home, the house was unlocked. So they went in, and Oreo was in there, our cat, black and white cat. So my dad went, come on over, Oreo, and he finally got a hold of him, put Oreo down in the basement cellar stairs. And so Oreo was down there. They went and sat in the living room right next to where the door was. And my wife Heidi walks in. She goes, what are you guys doing? In the middle of the day, what are you? Oh, we're just sitting here waiting for Oreo to open I want to show Bill how Oreo can open the cellar door. So they're sitting there, dead silence, and Heidi's going, oh man. So all of a sudden there's click, 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 and the door opens up and it swings in because the door's a little bit on a bias, and the weight of the cat opens right up into the room, jumps off, walks along, and Dad says, see, I told you so. And Bill goes, I'll be damned. You can just imagine Heidi coming in, and they're both sitting in the house. Just too much. And I've got another one about Henry Stanley, which, as Mike and Andy, his brother, and myself, we all played together a lot. We were right down the street, so we used to play in a sand pile with trucks and all sorts of stuff. So at the time, Henry Stanley was road agent. I think he must have been a road agent for 100 years, but he's telling the stories. But so, and one of us had a Tonka truck that looked just like the truck that he used for the road agency, a pickup truck, a blue pickup truck. So we'd all fight over who could be Henry for that period of time. So, but that's kind of a legend. But I did get this story. I think it was from William M. or William W.F., which would be Bill David's dad. I gotta remember what I was gonna say here, but I lost it. Oh, I know. So apparently when Bill Kidder was a child, there was a school bus, but it was a horse-drawn school bus. And Henry Stanley actually drove it. And I don't know, Pete, whether you would ever remember this.
No.
So, well, anyway, Bill's dad, William M., was the secretary of the First Baptist Church in New London, the big white church up here. And so he knew who gave what for, for givings. And so I guess he was at the table one night counting all the money and everything, and young Bill was there watching him, and I guess Bill's dad said to his wife, he said, Henry Stanley never comes to church, but he always gives. You know that story? So of course, Bill, being a kid, would be picked up by the school bus by the horse-drawn sleigh on his way to school, and Henry would be there driving it. And so finally he said, "Mr. Stanley, I need to know something." What? He says, "My father says you never go to church, but you give money to the church. Why is that?" And Henry said, "Well," he said, "I never want to live in a town that was not a church." He said, "That's why." He said, "I never want to live in a town where there wasn't a church." That's why. But anyway, I thought that was pretty cool. But anyway, we got other people too.
Other folks want to chime in? I want to tell two quick stories about, actually one more about Henry Stanley.
That can be him now.
He would bring a dinner pail to work with him in the morning. I mean, a pail, yay big, and he would take the cover off at whatever meal it was, and he would just eat continuously. Otherwise, he'd be talking, and Henry would be eating the whole time. Had this, you find these dinner pails now.
I've still got one. I still eat it every day.
It has layers.
There's layers, and you just work your way down. Tyler Grace was a police chief when I was a young kid going to school. And I remember there was a story of him standing in his slippers down there at the intersection of Parkside and the main street, directing the buses coming out of the school, standing in his slippers. There's a couple of stories about, he was a local kid, grew up here, and I just read in the town history that he built the stone walls around the president's house at Colby Sawyer College. But he was just a town guy, and he was the constable. And he, there's a couple of stories. So one story my father told me was Elmer Goins was going down the hill on his way into Elkins, that street that goes by the cemetery, and Tyler's house was right next to the cemetery, Mount Bunker Road, and that was Tyler's house.
It still is Tyler's house.
Is it?
Yeah, well, in my mind it is.
Yeah. I don't know who lives there now. Anybody live here? Well, anyway. Oh, you live in Tyler's house? Yeah. So anyway, Goins come down the hill, and he kicked it out of gear, and he's freewheeling down that hill by George Picknell's house. And and Tyler saw him going down the hill and thought that he was freewheeling, so he pulled up and pulled him over. He said, he says, Tyler says, I can't prove it, but I think we're freewheeling down that hill. And Elmer Goins looked him right in the eye and said, I can't prove it, but I think you're housekeeper.
Oh.
Tyler says, well, you just go along then. But this is small town stuff. I mean, but everybody knows everybody else. You can't get away with that. So Tyler, one time, my grandfather had a saw rig on a trailer. Fred Dodd had. saw rig, and he'd go around to different wood lots and he'd cut people's cordwood or whatever, firewood. And Fred didn't bother to get a plate for it, you know. You were just going down the road to the next guy's house, and you never bothered to register the trailer. Well, Tyler picked him up one time, wrote him a ticket. No plate on the trailer, didn't register the trailer. Well, Fred got indignant and said, all right, we'll go to court over it. So sure enough, they had to drive clear down to Danbury to the district court. The court at that time was in the judge's house, and the judge lived in Danbury. He was in his living room. The court was in his living room. So Fred and Tyler rode down there together. And, got in the judge court, and the judge fined my grandfather $20. Fred had a $100 bill, and he presented it to the court, and the court couldn't change it. And so Tyler reached in his pocket. Tyler paid the fine. And Fred said, by God, Tyler paid the fine. He never asked me for the money, and I never gave it to him.
That was good. Michael?
How long are we supposed to go here?
Is it true that Tyler didn't know how to write?
Yeah.
I thought he had to have
I don't
somebody
know.
else write out his housekeeper.
I don't know the answer to that.
No,
Go ahead.
I think it was Tyler who couldn't write.
Yeah.
And he had his
Housekeeper.
I didn't quite know what to call her. Peter, help me in with the story a little bit. Because Tyler couldn't write, so he had this woman that always sat in the passenger seat when he was out on patrol. And we, growing up, and you were just part of the edge of it, I think. We used to sit there, and Tyler would be parked in the public parking lot there with his engine just parking along, and there was some gentleman that used to ride his motorcycle down Main Street. And used to, well, I think he was. He's a gentleman. And we would. This gentleman who had a big Triumph motorcycle would get the thing going, and he'd just rev that up. Front wheel would come off, and just go right down. And there's Tyler with this woman. I can't remember her name in there. And by the time he got going, the gentleman on his motorcycle was long gone. So we said one day, and I'm not saying who was involved, Tyler decided, we decided that we were going to help Tyler. And somebody came in and with a jack that they took out of a garage and went, you remember this? They went in there and we got under the rear end. Tyler was half asleep, the woman was right next to her, and we cranked it up just about 3.5 inches off the ground. And this gentleman came roaring down on a Triumph Monteville, and Tyler wakes up, he puts it in reverse, and he just doesn't go anything. And the smart gentleman went there and turned around and came back again to add insult to injury. You remember that?
And the truth of the story is that if you saw Tyler without this woman beside him, you knew that you might just get a warning because he couldn't read it. He couldn't write it. So Tyler's alone tonight. So Ben Cochran.
Ben, yeah.
While we're on Tyler, yeah, Jerry Huntoon, who I worked with at Heath and all, and then Donnie Rowe from Sutton. Well, they used to tell a story. They were driving through London all the time in their hot rods, and Tyler was I think he was down by Holman's Corner, which is near the Lamplighter Hotel, and they were speeding, no question about it. So he saw him go by and he started chasing them. Well, they just got on it and took off, and I don't know exactly where they went, but the way the story
Murray's Flats. Murray's Flats.
Yeah, well, the way the story goes, I mean, maybe they went up to Burpee Hill and up and over Knight's Hill, but Jerry Huntoon says, yep, we went up through there and come around. He said we lapped him.
Oh, yeah. Back then, they only had constables of the caliber that we just heard stories about. Tyler.
Law enforcement in New London was never really strict.
One of the guys that they mentioned in the town history was Sidney Pedro. Now, Sid Pedrick, as I understand, wasn't the brightest bulb in the box, but he was the town constable. And he, you know, so when Blodgett's Landing got on fire, Fred Todd was in the volunteer fire department, and Sidney was down there at the end of the pier trying to keep people off of, you know, from wandering out on the pier because the firemen put the fire out. So Fred came a little late, parked his car, and started down toward the landing. And Sidney Pedrick, get out of the way, Sid, or I'll throw you in the lake. That's Fred. That's what he said. Out of the way, Fred.
There's a little cart in the big building that was made by Sidney Pedrick,
Really?
I think. A wooden, that some lady used to go get her groceries here in New London. She'd walk and pull that little wooden cart.
Well, there was a guy named Dizzy Emery.
Addie Gay.
Addie Gay's cart, yeah.
I just read that today.
There was a guy named Dizzy Emery, might have been my Aunt Alice, my father's sister, told me about. Dizzy Emery had this goat cart. And Dizzy, you know, he hadn't have a full deck, so, but he could deliver groceries. He had this little goat cart, and he'd deliver people's groceries for him. And they'd see him up on the main street in London, you know, everybody's chiding Dizzy Emery. And Fred would say, Dizzy, making any money today? Dizzy'd look at him and say, well, no, it's worth something to be in business. Oh, Lordy. Anybody have any other stories? I think we may be nearing the end of this great session. This has been a great
Have any
session.
Dr. Oler stories or Dr. Clough stories?
Oh, my Lord. I don't.
Isn't there a story about Dr. Oler and the George the dog?
George the dog.
George
yeah.
the dog?
Came to the hospital with him every Sunday. Right, Peter? Didn't George, your dog, come with Dr. Oler every Sunday?
No, George took himself around.
He took himself out.
John told the story about George died, and Priscilla put him in a car for John to take him to the vet or wherever they were going to take him, and he forgot. And he had George in the back seat of the car for about three days.
Oh, I don't know about that. I can show you right where George is.
Hey, kid. This story is about Colonel Mel Hollidge, who lived in the Ragged Mountain Fish and Game Club over at Potter Place. But it connects to the New London Hospital. And I knew Mel about 20 years ago when he was in his 90s, and he was still cross-country skiing. And he had a lot of injuries. And he came over to the New London Hospital for treatment once. And I don't have this story firsthand, but I think parts of it could be somewhat true. So he arrived at the hospital and they took an x-ray, but when the doctor greeted him, he didn't greet him by name, didn't acknowledge him, which he normally would, and Mel definitely expected that, so he was a little offended, but anyway. So about a half an hour later, the x-ray comes back and he puts it up on the screen the way they did, and he goes, "Oh, Mel!"
I've got another one about Henry Stanley that just came to mind. It's amazing. You never really realized what a character this guy was. One of them was the last time we had a town meeting when he went, and it was to do with they were going to appoint the road agent instead of being voted on, which it used to be for years. And Henry was there the last time, and it was voted that he would be appointed by the selectmen or hired by the selectmen. And so Henry got up. He kind of reminded me of Abe Lincoln a little bit. He had kind of sunken cheeks and thin, tall, huge hands like what you said. And he says, "Well," he says, there ain't no sense in coming to town meeting anymore unless you can vote, he says, and there ain't no sense in coming unless you can vote on things. And that's it. That's the last time we ever saw him. You had to kind of be there, but it was almost like that Norman Rockwell painting that you see with the fellow like that. The other one is that I remember, and I just kind of remembered it now, but where Marilyn Kidder lives now is where we grew up, and on Knights Hill, and there was an open well that was on the lawn in the center, and you still have a circle around it. And I remember Dad always trying to keep a cover on the well, so none of us there were quite a few wells on the property, as they were on old farms like that. And so when I was a young kid, Henry Stanley was road agent, and they were tearing up the sidewalks on Main Street, and they had big 4x4 pieces of granite, and they were putting pavement down. And so they were taking them all down to the town shed on Pleasant Street and stockpiling. And so my dad saw Henry go by one day, and he said, "You know, Henry," he said, "are those for the taking? Those sidewalk things?" Henry said, "Yeah." He said, "Yeah, you can have one. You want to cover your well up or whatever." So I guess Henry left, and Dad went down with his pickup and a chain, and he got pretty good sized stones. I mean, almost
Tabletop, half
this
this tabletop size.
about that thick, all granite. So Dad hooked onto it, got a chain around it, he dragged it all the way from Pleasant Street up paved road and all the way to the house, and put it on the well. And I guess Henry stopped by later on that, I could see what it done to the road. But he says, if you wanted that delivered, I could have done it for you. All the damage to the road. I just happened to think of that.
May I just say that Putnam and Will, your family stone over on the old Main Street Cemetery is one of those sidewalk stones. And on the back side is this plaque that's affixed to the stone that says, "On this stone generations have trod, known only to the wind and the sun and God." And I just think that is the coolest, one of the coolest engravings or plaques in the whole cemetery. It's just really, really touching. I think we may have come to the. Oh,
I got a request for you. Does anybody in here remember the Trampoline Center?
Yeah.
Does anybody happen to have pictures of it?
Oh.
Some people don't believe it existed. We have no pictures. Oh, I know it.
Bill, how many trampolines were there? I was trying to. There were 10?
Yeah.
Oh, I was thinking 5. Okay.
No. It was 2 rows of 5 each.
2 rows.
Oh, okay.
Where I remember it. Where Spring Ledge is now.
When you pull into Spring Ledge, if you turn and face Main Street, they were right where you are.
Well, let that be a general call to go through our archives at home. Maybe some of us somewhere have pictures of the Trampoline Center. I know I remember it.
That would be great.
It was great fun, and I think that should be included in the history. I really.
It's in the town.
It is in.
With stories, you see, it's stories about it.
Yeah.
You drive by that place, of course it was just a field at the time, and the trampolines were all ground level with a pit.
The
All
pit,
you could
right.
see her all the way through.
I was talking to Bill a while ago about the Trampoline Center, and I said, geez, it closed down, but I said, it's probably the liability and everything of it. He said, well, Dad did fix a lot of legs for nothing.
One more story about Bee Weed and Sillyville. This goes back to New London being a dry town. And so you had to go to Sillyville, you went to Towsley's store over in George's Mills. That's where Fred went first place when the snow started flying. He had to plow roads. First road he plowed was right over to Towsley's store and get beer, and then they drive around all night. These are things I try to forget.
Towsley would come down,
Knock on the door.
Knock or beep your horn, and he'd come down in his pajamas like you.
Yeah.
How do you know that?
There was so down the other end, village was Sillyville, and B. Weed had this store. And as my father used to tell the story, B wasn't literate, and so I mean, she kind of knew how much stuff cost, but she couldn't, you know, add it all up. So you'd be sliding stuff by, and she'd say, "Well, 8 times 8's 88, you know, whatever. Give me $2.30 or whatever the heck it was, you know." And so that was it. And B had a daughter, Phyllis. Phyllis Weed. And Phyllis, she was a character. I can remember working at the Edgewood Inn. She was waitress there, and God, she had to be in the mid-60s at that point. I was tending bar down there, and she didn't take guff from anybody, any way. You know, you got on the wrong side of Phyllis, and you were going to have a rotten meal. But if you befriended her, it was okay. And Phyllis used to, and when she got off her shift, she'd come by the bar and have a couple of pops, and before she went home, she'd tell some stories. And because she used to work for her mother in the store down there. Of course, you know, New London had the church and the bank and And she'd say, Phyllis would get lifted up, and she'd say, "Well, these people, they come down to my store and buy beer, but you see them on the main street of New London, they don't know you." Gotta love being weird. So I think we're pretty close to the time we need to say goodbye. We have 7 to 8:30. It's after 8:30, unless we have any more pressing stories. We are good to go. Thank you all for your hors d'oeuvres, yep. Cheese. You're welcome to stay around and give us a follow for next year. That'd be great.